Resistance Management School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by CropLife Canada.
Kelvin Heppner with Real Agriculture at Cropsapalooza at Portage La Prairie, Manitoba, joined by Rob Gulden, Associate Professor in Weeds and Agronomy at the University of Manitoba. And Rob, this canola plot behind us, this side has a few weeds in it, but this side definitely a lot more. What's this plot showing us?
We're looking at the impact of crop seeding rates or higher seeding densities on weeds and weed competition with the crop. So what we have on the left side here is we've got a higher seeding rate, so target density of about 130 plants per meter squared, or at least 130 seeds per meter squared were planted. Obviously didn't get all those up. And then on the other side, we're looking at a little bit lower at about 70 as a target density. And all these treatments, not just the canola, the weed control, the only weed control that was done before planting was a pre-seed burn down or burn off. And then the weed control that you see is the ability of the crop and its management only. It's not to say that that's a management practices that farmers would use, but what we're trying to illustrate here is how important increasing seeding densities are in making the crop more competitive. And there are good reasons for that. These days, we still have some serious issues with herbicide resistance in Manitoba, and what we're trying to do with encouraging higher planting densities is to make the crop more competitive so that the selection pressure for herbicide resistance is reduced, and if a producer already has herbicide-resistant weeds, then the crop is much more able to deal with those in case a herbicide is used that doesn't control them anymore.
Okay. First of all, Rob, 130 plants or seeds per square meter versus 70. What's that in per square foot?
It's about a tenth of that, so it's about 12, 13 plants per square foot and about 6 to 7, somewhere in that ballpark per square foot. So those are the target seeding rates. Now we know with canola that we certainly don't get one for one in terms of emergence and germination. I think germination here was pretty good, but we expect our densities a little bit lower than that. So probably 110, 120, somewhere in there, and maybe 60, 70 or 50, 60 in the lower density one. And the 50-60 would be not far off what we see in production fields on average across Western Canada. It's that's roughly our average is about 60.
So is this a realistic expectation to ask producers to increase seeding rates with, we know where canola seed costs are? That's it sounds like an uphill battle for you, Rob.
It is. Welcome to my world. No, it certainly is. I mean, there are crops where the increased seeding rates make sense. Economically speaking, there are crops where the economic argument is a little more difficult to make, but at the same time, it's something that we got to keep in mind. What particularly we've been seeing with canola is that farmers have been lowering their seeding rates to actually get even below those 60 plants per meter squared. And 60 is a good target that other research has shown that our modern hybrid varieties at 60 actually perform quite well. But you don't want to be an awful lot below that. If you are much below that, you're going to run into yield limitations and not maximizing yield, even under perfect weed control. But the weed control benefit increases as we have higher densities. It's very important to have ground cover from the crop early in the season and to maximize that ground cover early on, even with our faster growing crops, and it's even more important, I think, with our slower growing crops that we are growing these days. But definitely the economic argument is tough to make. At the same time, having said that, a higher plant stand density will reduce the number of in-crop herbicide applications that you're probably going to have to make or rely on. So a single in-crop application might be good enough. And so there are some savings there, or potential savings there. So it's, it's a trade-off, like all things in agriculture.
That 6 plants or 60 plants or seeds per
meter squared. Yeah.
Per meter squared.
Yeah.
Is that kind of where you really start to run into competition issues, though? If there's a critical threshold?
Yeah, it's tough to say what the critical threshold is with weeds. Certainly in weed-free conditions, we've got numbers for Western Canada that, depending on whether you're in a high-yielding zone or a low-yielding zone or scenario, the higher densities in the low-yielding zones do better. The break-even point, or where you maximize yield, tends to be the lower density into the high-yielding regions and the slightly higher density low-yielding regions. And it can be as low as 40 plants per meter squared. But keep in mind that you're putting a lot of pressure on the herbicide to keep that stand weed-free, so there's no ill effects of weeds. And so, yes, we can probably maximize yield at some relatively low densities, particularly in canola, which of course is a very indeterminate plant, and so it covers the spaces quite quickly. But the faster we cover that space with canola or plants, the better the weed control will naturally be. And so 60 is a good number. If we can get producers up to 60 across the board would be great, because we've seen a lot of fields well below that at the end of the season. I've seen numbers in the 20s and 30s that were fields that were taken through the yield, and certainly there probably is a yield penalty there. Much above 60, it'd be great to go there. I'm not sure you need to be much above. We've done experiments where we get all the way to 80 and 100 plants. So these are plants, not seeds per meter squared, but plants per meter squared. And the yield curve is pretty level there. We certainly don't see the yield drop off at those higher seeding rates. And if we are in a more stressful situation or lower yielding scenario, then the max is reached a little bit later. So we're looking at 80 to 100 plants per meter squared, where we're starting to max out yield under ideal conditions. That's not with weed competition, and so densities are important even for something like canola, which is like I said, an indeterminate crop that's very good at filling holes.
And like you said before, this is important information to have when it comes to glyphosate-resistant kochia or other examples of resistance that we are starting to see more of.
Absolutely. It's very important for resistance weed management, and I'll just throw out some numbers from the last herbicide resistance survey that was done in Manitoba. So that was done in conjunction with my group and Dr. Hugh Becky. And it turns out that in Manitoba now 4 out of 5 fields have a Group 1 herbicide-resistant wild oat population in them. So these weeds are very, very common now. And the herbicide options, depending on what crop we're in, can be very limited. And so we do want to make sure that we don't end up with yield losses due to weeds that we can't control in the field anymore due to low densities. And of course, where the crop is low density, is not competing well with weeds. If those weeds aren't managed, the higher density crop will obviously suppress those weeds, compete with them, and those weeds will produce fewer seeds. So it's all about future seed bank management as well. There's a benefit to it for upcoming seasons. And again, when we do that, we need to rely less on herbicides the following year. So it is part of a rotation as well. This is not unique to a crop. It's unique. It's common to all crops. And we've got a number of crops here where we can show this. And on the economic side, if we have crops, for example, like the cereal crops where the seed costs are relatively low, the economic argument is not that strong to cut rates. I think it's do you want to be near optimum or above that, for sure, and manage the weeds that way, in anticipation of a canola crop or whatever may come where the seed costs are higher and maybe seeding rates aren't as high as they could be. So it's a lot of planning involved.
Yeah, a rotational approach.
Absolutely, rotational approach, and certainly we want to see integrated management tools across the rotation. We always talk about them in individual crops because we do have to optimize them within individual crops. But the general principles of good crop establishment, excellent fertility package, keeping the fertilizer away from the weeds and feeding the crop only, all those things all add together to certainly increase weed management, but also productivity of the crop. So the seeding rate thing is not only a weed management tool, it's also very important from a crop productivity perspective outright, and good sound agronomy to start out with.
All right. Very good. Thanks for your time, Rob.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.